All right, it is 12 o'clock. Thank you for joining us on our series today, starting here. We are going to discuss fencing. We have several different educators on today, but I'm going to start off with the basics. My name is Jill Richards. I'm the Ohio County Extension educator. We have Cora Carter that's going to talk about small ruminants. Kyle Weaver is going to discuss cattle. Poultry and Horse will be brought to you by Miranda Edge, and Gina Anderson will wrap up with the llama and alpaca fencing. So if we go ahead and get started, we'll start with the basics. All right, so the very first thing that you're going to want to do before you do anything at all is you're going to want to call 811, and you always want to do that before you dig. They're going to come out and mark everything on your lake, whether it's the gas line, the water line, power lines, phone lines, cable lines, whatever could be around your house and your property. They're going to be able to mark those lines for you. It's very important to call them first, just so you don't hit any of those. Nothing worse than being at home needing your Wi-Fi service and you cut that when you go to set some fence posts. So make sure you call those first. All right, our next slide. Something else that's really important to know when you're starting your fence is knowing where your property lines are and knowing the ordinances that go with setting up a fence. So you might think, oh, well, I know where my property is, but you might want to make sure that that's marked clearly. Nothing worse than putting all the time, effort, and money into building a fence, and then you have to move it because you find out you actually got just a little bit of it on your neighbor's property. So save yourself some headache and definitely have those property lines marked before you start. Next slide. And before you ever dig a hole, always start to develop a plan. It's nothing worse than starting building your fence and not putting the right effort in. So think about what's going to work for you. Not everything works the same for everybody. You know, financial stability, that plays a factor. What kind of livestock you have, your space, all of that. You want to make sure that you can utilize your space the best that's going to work for you and for what you're trying to do. So, you know, there's different kind of fences. There's permanent fences, temporary fences. You know, you need to figure out where you're going to put your lanes and gates. I've heard a story, and I don't know where this came from or even if it's 100% true, but someone put up a beautiful fence and forgot to put a gate in. So it's really hard to get the livestock in and out of a pasture if there's no gates. So make sure that you plan for that. And think about if you're going to be moving them or rotating them when you're developing that plan, to really look at where that would be the best place to fit in those gates or maybe lanes to move them back and forth into different pastures, or, you know, if you're doing any kind of rotational grazing. Those things are all very important when you're developing your plan. So figure out what's going to work for you and utilize your space the best that you can. And that's just a duplicate of more in depth. So keep on going, Brett. Thank you. So your next part is selecting posts. So this is where the financial impact of putting a fence in is really going to start to play a factor, you know, and possibly you could even think about the eye appeal of it. So if you might have a busy highway and you want to have a really stable fence, you know, and you can financially take on that cost. Wooden posts are great. They've got to be treated so they won't rot. You know, they don't bend like you do with your metal posts, and they don't come out of the ground as easily. Now they will come out of the ground sometimes. I've experienced that myself and had to, you know, fix that along the way. So whether you're planning on building a brand new fence and you're wanting to find out some tips on that, or maybe you're going to replace some fence and try to do something different to change your property up a little bit. Selecting your post is a very important factor. Wooden posts or steel posts. Steel posts cost less and they weigh less. So if you're going to be doing a lot of stuff by hand, moving around a bunch of steel posts is a lot easier to do than a big bundle of wooden posts. They're driven into the ground easier, which also means they come out of the ground easier. Not always easy, but definitely easier than if you drive in a wooden post. And they are fireproof, which hopefully is never an issue, but it is something to take into consideration. And next slide. How to set a post. So you think, oh, well, I have this great idea. I'm going to go out and I'm going to start setting a post. Well, the very first thing you want to do is clear your fence line. You think, well, I'll just clear it as I go. Well, that's really not the best way to do it, because you're not going to get the straight fence that maybe you're going to, once you got at the end of it. But you want to start with your corner post. You can either dig holes or you can use a post driver. If you think that you could borrow a post driver or find one, that is a lot easier if you're setting very many posts than it is to dig all the holes. But you don't have to have one. It just kind of makes it a little bit easier as far as your labor is concerned. You're going to want to install those brace posts for permanent fencing 8 feet from your corner post. And then you're going to want to put in the H brace there. There's a picture and a diagram that shows you exactly how to do that and how to anchor those in. You want to make sure your corner posts and your braces and everything are in there just nice and secure. Our next one. So once you get your corner post set, you can set your fence posts about every 10 feet. And this is for a permanent fence. So if you're doing your perimeter, the outside, that's something that you're not going to want to move. Those can be, you know, a little bit more expensive when you are setting your post, you're picking your wooden post, putting in your fence, whether it's whatever you're putting in. But those are some guidelines that's pretty average. We're going to get real in depth with each one of the species, depending on what you're interested in. But you can always use a marking string from corner to corner. I know we don't have a lot of straight lines. Our fence is around the hill and over the hill and down in the hollows and stuff. So we try to make the fence row as straight as possible, but there's really no corner to corner. It's corner to the next, 100 yards, maybe, if we can get straight. But use a marking string to be able to get that and see if you can get your fence row as straight as possible, especially if it is a perimeter fence and a permanent fence. It's going to look a lot better if you can keep it straight, and it's going to be more eye appealing. So next, I believe we're going to get into our small ruminants. I'll turn it over to Cora.
Hi, I just want to talk a little bit about some special considerations for small ruminants. So barbed wire is not a great idea for sheep and goats with fleece, as your fleece can get caught on the barbs, and not only does it pull out and cause some problems with quality of fleece, if that's what you're raising sheep or goats for, but it can also wrap around those barbs and actually render them ineffective. So even if you're not raising sheep for their wool, it can be a way for them to get out and go places, especially it doesn't effectively contain goats, especially if they're not well-spaced barbed wire. Next slide, please. The best choice, an excellent choice for especially non-horned sheep and goats, is a heavy or extra heavyweight woven wire. It should be about 39 inches high or taller, depending on the breed. You can also get a mesh fence, which is going to have smaller holes, and that would also be a good option. Next, please. Temporary fencing, like Jill was saying before, you don't use that on your property borders. On your property borders, you're going to want a permanent fence, but for temporary fencing, you can use those for your grazing management systems. We talked a few weeks ago about rotational grazing, and so these types of temporary nets or temporary electric tape are good options for doing your grazing management systems. For your sheep and goats, you're probably going to want to stick with the electric netting, but you do need to train your livestock to it, and it must be hot. There can be problems with wildlife. We've had this temporary electric netting on our property with our sheep, and we've had some deer get tangled up in it. So you can have some problems. So you're going to want to keep an eye on it and walk it and move it every few weeks or months as you require for your rotational grazing. But it can be a good option for that temporary fencing. Next slide, please. Again, horned sheep and goats, but also the non-horned sheep and goats have a tendency to follow the grass is always greener on the other side rule. So they do like to poke their heads through woven wire and have a trouble getting it back. There are better ways to prevent those animals from being able to do that, but those fences do tend to be a little bit more expensive. So electric fences or an electric line on the inside of your woven wire can help discourage this behavior. Next slide, please. A lot of putting up a fence for small ruminants is preventing predators from entering your property. 5-strand high tensile electric fence or that woven wire with an electric wire near the bottom can help prevent predators from entering your property. You also want to make sure that you prevent vegetation from growing up and blocking your electric current. Coyotes can actually pass through an opening of 4.5 inches square or smaller, so or bigger. So smaller squares than that, like a 6 by 3 inches or a 3 by 3 inches, will be more effective in preventing coyote problems. But you can also buy fencing that has a fixed knot, which means that the fence can't spread open when the coyote shoves his head through the hole. So you might want to invest in something like that. It's going to be a little bit more expensive, but it does prevent the stays from sliding along on that woven wire and allowing animals to pass through the woven wire. Okay, I think that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand it over to Kyle now.
Well, thank you, Cora. So we're going to just talk about some cattle fencing, and one of the things that's becoming very popular in the cattle industry is the high tensile wire. It's something that's very popular for a couple of reasons with our cattle producers. One is that's very strong type of fencing. It's very durable. There's not as much maintenance with the high tensile wire as there is with other type of fencing for cattle. And as our colleague just said, we can use that with a variety of animals, and you can have it electrified or non-electrified. So if we can go to the next slide, Britt. So the other type that's also very popular with our cattle producers is woven wire. We have different size grids, as Cora mentioned. It does provide a certain amount of security for our cattle. Keeps our animals in or out. One of the things that if you've been a cattle producer, as I grew up on a beef and dairy farm, cows get out at 2 or 3 in the morning and they get out when they want to get out. And that's the, you want to keep those animals in. So if you keep the animals in, you can also keep predators out. So that's the security for those animals. It can be used again for a variety of animals. And one thing that cattle likes to do is they like to push on fences. They like to scratch themselves. Sometimes you can put a single strand of electric wire up to keep those cattle off of that pushing on that fence. So next slide, Britt. So we go to barbed wire, which is kind of a more traditional type of cattle fencing. It can be 1 to 6 strands of barbed wire. You can make that a temporary fence or a permanent fence with barbed wire. You can take a single strand of barbed wire and make it a temporary fence for rotational grazing, these types of things. In the dairy industry, we used single strands of barbed wire all the time. That was pretty much our entire fencing system. As long as your animals are docile enough, they shouldn't cause you too many issues with a temporary or a single strand of barbed wire. But it does require lots and lots of maintenance. That's the one thing about barbed wire, that it does stretch quite a bit, especially when an animal gets to pushing on it, it grows through it. And you do have to do lots and lots of maintenance to that. Those barbs, as we looked at before, they can injure your animals, they can injure people. If you've ever gotten tangled with a barbed wire roll or just any kind of barbed wire, it does hurt. It hurts your animals just the same. So in those predators, a barbed wire fence, whether it's 1 strand or 6 strand, is not going to keep a coyote out or any kind of predator. So it's important to think about those things. Just a couple of pictures that we have here. Barbed wire and our fence chargers. There are really 2 types of fence chargers. One is what I call the hardwire fence charger. It has to be plugged into an electrical outlet. Usually that's in the corner of the barn somewhere. And then you have the solar chargers, which are more out in the open. You can use those in a variety of ways. Then we have the insulators, which is on top of a temporary T-post in the bottom right-hand corner. Those insulators, if you grew up on a farm, had cattle with those single strands of barbed wire or smooth wire, you have those insulators in lots and lots of places. So just a great example of 3 types of cattle fencing that are very popular in the cattle industry today. So I think Miranda is up next.
Okay, thank you. And so the first one I'm going to talk about is poultry. And like everybody else has said already, predator protection is really our biggest reason why we have some fencing, of course, to keep them in the fence as well. However, with chickens, if you've ever had them get curious or a garden nearby, they don't really stay in a fence very well unless you've got a little bit of a charge to it maybe or something like that. So for the main portion of our bird fencing's going to be to make sure that they are protected against those predators that might come in and try to either steal eggs or actually grab the actual chickens. Next slide, please. So it's going to depend on what your needs are and whether you are maybe a backyard flock owner, if you're looking to get into more of a high level layer production and you're going to need a larger flock size, or even if you are growing meat birds. Everything kind of has a little bit different needs. Backyard flocks sometimes are in different zones, and you need to look at the ordinances within those zones that allow you to keep birds and what kind of fencing maybe is required to keep those birds. If you're on a certain acreage of maybe 5 acres or less, and the zoning requires that you must use a chicken wire with an enclosed top, those are things to make sure you understand before you start with your flock management and even before you buy the first bird. Going above and beyond that, you may be in an agriculture zone that doesn't really have a necessary ordinance for type of flock, or of rather fencing for your flock, but maybe you're close by to neighbors and you are trying to make sure they don't get into their garden space, or maybe getting out and being attacked by a neighborhood dog or something of that nature, which is kind of the situation I'm in with my particular flock. So those guys may have a large chicken run. You can look into taller fencing. I use an 8-foot tall chicken wire fence for a run, and then I have an enclosed coop with a mesh lined floor with gravel and lime and stuff on the top of it to try to keep predators from crawling underneath it. So not only on the top you're looking to use some sort of a fencing material, you'll want to also look at underneath, because predators looking at chickens do dig. They can get through small sized holes, and they do climb. So poultry can be a little bit difficult until you get that management set. Meat birds you can do in small pens individually. The popular free range options are to use a box, and I believe it's a Joel Salatin box that is pictured here, where it's basically an open bottom and the birds are allowed to eat. They have free access to a meat bird diet and the pasture and are moved on a daily basis. Next slide. So as I alluded, free ranging versus enclosed pens also kind of give you a range of options and ideas. Here you can see we've got an enclosed run with the tall fence, and that is where the birds go in at night when maybe some of our nocturnal predators are a little more highly active. I like to keep my birds in that space at night, but they are allowed to go and free range in a space during the day. I've also used with separate flocks, or if I've got new birds, I've also created small tractors with chicken wire wrapped around PVC pipes, and that allows for me to move those birds around. They get a chance to still free range, but they're separated from my other animals until about 30 to 35 days, and I make sure nothing's sick and nothing's going to make my current flock sick on that area. Now also you can just let them free range, or you can use some different woven wire netting, such as like what we saw with the small ruminants, to keep them in. So next slide, please. So the type of fencing materials that you'll want to use probably are going to be very small wires. You've seen in several pictures within this slide set different sized holes. Chicken wire is very, very popular. It's a hexagon shape that's very hard to stretch. You can also get a very small squared material that, like you see in the left picture in this slide, which also is very hard to stretch and maybe keeps those chickens a little bit safer. I like to use this particular fencing material on the base of my floor in my coop or in my run. And then a little cheaper option is that hexagon shaped chicken wire that I would use up on top. On the right, you'll see that there is a woven wire fence, and these are specifically chicken woven wire netting, where the top squares might be a little bit larger, but as you get lower into the fence material, the size of the hole gets smaller, so that number one, chicks don't get out, and number two, those predators have a harder time getting in. Of course, these do stretch, so I highly recommend that you use a charge on them. And training those birds to respect that woven wire mesh fence is very helpful in maintaining a space. You'll see several large layer birds that are promoting free range to use a mesh fence to keep them at least in an area and continue to move them on a daily basis. This allows for them to be safe and free range, but those predators are less likely to get a hold of the birds or the eggs and reduce that flock owner's flock size and overall inputs for their business. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll switch to horses. A little bit different, but again, much like cattle, there's different options and there's different expenses, but you'll see several fences that look very similar to what you see with cattle. Horses in pictures and videos and movies, and if you've ever been to Lexington in Kentucky, you'll see wooden or polyboard is kind of like the white picket fence of the horse world. It is attractive. It's kind of a status symbol, and very heavy duty. You can have different options with it. It's very easy for that horse to see, strong, heavy, but it can be a little bit more expensive, especially now since our lumber prices have been going up. And that maintenance may be a little bit more expensive with whether you're painting it, if you've got damage, if you've got it double lined, as you see in this top picture. This is a very sturdy, thick fence that you would see at the Kentucky Horse Park. And it would take a lot of maintenance should a portion of that fence be broken or one of the posts in the ground rot, break off, any of that thing. A little bit cheaper, but a similar product would be like a poly board or a poly wire, and this is much, much lighter weight. It's got a similar aesthetic as that wooden board fence, but it can have some effect by the UV lights, and so the maintenance could be less expensive, but depending on the amount of shade versus open sunlight, you could have to replace those poly pieces a little bit more often. Next slide, please. Woven wire is another popular option, as it is still fairly aesthetically pleasing. It is easier to put up, it's solid and easy for the horse to see, and for anybody else to be able to see the horses for observation. It's not as expensive as a completely wooden fence. You're still going to have your wood posts in the ground, and sometimes, as you can see in this fence or in this particular picture, a wood top board to keep that top of the woven wire straight. Horses tend to be very curious, especially if they're friendly. You've got little children wanting to give them carrots, and they're going to hang their head over that woven wire fence, pull on it, stretch it, and maybe even pop out some of your steeples that are holding it onto your posts. So it can be a little bit harder to mend should it break, but it is a little bit easier to keep maintained and useful for a longer period of time. Next slide. And just as with cattle, high tensile is another option that horse owners are going to. It's a little bit less expensive. It's much easier to put up than even the woven wire. Again, you're going to have the same wooden posts, but your maintenance level is a lot cheaper. If one strand breaks, you've got just one strand to replace. It can be charged. And it's just kind of a better economical option overall. The downside to that is for the horse, it is harder to see. So a lot of times you'll see that flags, red flags, white flags, or even a white poly wire is included into that fence line, either in the top, the middle, somewhere for that horse to be able to see it. The other downsides, and the pictures tend to be a little bit graphic, is when these if horses do get curious, start rubbing on it, or even young foals trying to reach through to grab grass, they can get caught, and it's very easy for their tissues to be sliced and damaged. And so if this is a show horse, this is something that, you know, the blemishes on a horse may cause some issues. The high tensile wire can be very dangerous if you've got a horse that maybe is a little bit more accident prone. Keeping it charged, of course, helps them stay off of it. But again, you do have to walk it. You have to check that charge, make sure there's nothing laying on it, just as you would any other type of charged fence. Next, please. And finally, for horses is barbed wire. This is it's not a popular choice, more to aesthetics than anything else. Of course, it's probably a less expensive option. If you're buying a property, it's probably going to have some sort of a barbed wire and or woven wire fence to it if it has ever had livestock on it in the past. It's pretty easy to stretch tight. Of course, it does stretch. And when horses find out that it does stretch, they tend to want to rub on it. And it does take out manes, it takes out tails. So again, the aesthetics of a show horse or something of a higher quality animal that you're trying to maintain the visibility and the aesthetics of that animal, these wouldn't be a great choice, because just like in those sheep, it catches that hair, and then that barb no longer does its job, and it's pulling out animals' hair, which could cause an issue with the total aesthetics of that animal. Okay, next slide. I think we're on to llamas and Miss Gina.
All right, thank you. So our final livestock are llamas and alpacas, and we've really talked about just about all we can about fencing. So this is just some do's and don'ts. We do want to keep the fence flush to the ground. Like many of the other animals, they get curious, and the grass is always greener on the other side. So if we're keeping it flush to the ground, they're not going to get under there. They're not going to stick their heads under there. The crias won't get under there or be subject to coyotes, which happens. Using the fences that have small squares or small openings is, again, best for these animals. We can use a little bit of electric fencing just to keep them from rubbing on it. Like the other livestock, they are notorious for sticking their heads over fences if they're short enough, rubbing on it. So doing that electric fence, just a single strand, to teach them to stay off of it would be helpful. We also want to make sure our fence height is probably 6 feet, between 5 and 6 feet, because we want to keep out predators, but we also want to keep out deer. So llamas and alpacas can pick up parasites from deer, and we want to keep the deer out of our pasture. So using a 6-foot fence is best. And then, like the other animals, using barbed wire is really not feasible for llamas and alpacas, because we would be pulling out their fiber and damaging what we're trying to harvest from that animal. So those are just some of our do's and don'ts for llamas and alpacas. And Britt, I think we can go to the last slide and open it up for questions.
Yeah, so thanks everybody. Feel free to unmute or put your questions in the chat box. I'm not seeing any questions right now. I will go ahead and launch our poll for today. So if you were listening, if you could please help us out with answering those 2 evaluation questions, that would be really helpful. And we'll stay on for a couple of minutes while you finish the poll, and feel free to ask questions.
And the next program is April 29th on biosecurity. So mark your calendar for that one.
So I guess I'm going to take this one because I'm a sheep person. But training all animals to electric fence is going to be a little bit similar. So you make sure that you expose them just a little short amount of period at a time. and make sure the fence is nice and hot when they first go out to meet it. And you want a few of them to touch it and see what it's about. Does anybody have also something to say about training maybe cattle to
Smaller
fence?
areas. Yep, definitely smaller areas
Mm.
to start with so that they understand that a fence line is a fence line no matter how big. My livestock guardian dogs tend to help with that as well because they know that it's hot. And the older sheep will teach the younger sheep, just like the older livestock will teach the younger livestock, and they can start to hear it even when it starts popping if it's nice and hot.
Mhm.
Yeah, you definitely want it to always be hot when you're training them, because if there's some vegetation causing some problems and they touch it one time and it's not hot, then they will start to challenge it. And actually, it's important if your sheep are heavy wool sheep that you shear them before you put them out on the electric fence the first time, because if they touch it with their wool on, then they might not get as strong of a shock. So it is important that they're sheared before they go out on the.
All right, so that wraps it up for today. Thank you for joining us.